studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Wednesday, May 13th, 2015. On today's show, we'll hear from acclaimed economist Richard Wolff about the history of the U.S. economy and how corporations have taken every advantage of technology at the expense of workers' rights. And author Sandy Tolan joins us in studio to discuss his new book, Children of the Stone, The Power of Music in a Hard Land. He'll share the story of Palestinian musician Ramzi Aburedwan. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris, Assistant Professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Sonali.
Well, yesterday, Senate Democrats, led by Elizabeth Warren and others, stymied their own president's trade deal when they blocked fast-track authority for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The TPP is a multi-nation so-called free trade treaty that many see as NAFTA on steroids. This morning, Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid offered a concession to the GOP, which backs Obama on the TPP, but his offer was not accepted. Democrats are pushing for greater worker protection as a condition. One of the countries that have expressed interest in joining the TPP is the Philippines, where a major fire at a footwear factory in Manila this morning claimed dozens of lives. The fire may have started when a welding spark hit flammable chemicals. More than 65 workers were trapped inside, and so far there are no reported survivors. Courtney, won't the TPP make the already non-existent worker protections around the world even weaker? And do you see the Senate vote as a major victory?
Well, I think the Senate vote is a step in the right direction, although it's only the first of many battles that we're going to see, because this is an issue that's not going to go away. But in terms of this, the TPP really threatening labor protections, absolutely this is going to be an issue. Public Citizen has done some really amazing work on the potential consequences of this agreement. And one of the key features of the agreement is that it would allow corporations to sue countries if they pass forms of legislation or policy that would essentially cut into their bottom line. So if things like environmental protections or labor protections or the defense of net neutrality get in the way of acquiring profits, a corporation can sue. And this is something that I think really poses a threat to state sovereignty and really undermines the abilities of national governments to protect their citizens. So, I think we should be wary not only of the kind of trickle-up model that these kind of neoliberal trade reforms espouse, but we should also really be attentive to the kind of anti-democratic impulses of these agreements and the dangers that they pose to workers and to the environment and to state sovereignty.
Human Rights Watch has released a groundbreaking first-of-its-kind report detailing the abuse of mentally ill prisoners. But the report didn't focus on China, Saudi Arabia, or other supposedly repressive regimes. It was about the U.S.'s brutal prison system, and its title says it all: callous and cruel use of force against inmates with mental disabilities in U.S. jails and prison. The group accused U.S. prison authorities of, quote, unnecessary, excessive, and even malicious force on prisoners with mental disabilities such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. It detailed how officials, quote, needlessly and punitively deluge mentally ill prisoners with chemical sprays, shock them with electric stun devices, strap them to chairs and beds for days on end, break their jaws, noses, ribs, or leave them with lacerations, second-degree burns, deep bruises, and damaged internal organs. HRW contends that this abuse has contributed to the deaths of prisoners. Courtney, this is such a deeply disturbing report. Can you imagine how U.S. media would be covering it if it was about another country?
I mean, if it were another country, say somewhere in Africa or the Middle East, the narrative would sound completely different. We'd be framing it as a massive human rights crisis and a crisis of democratic governance. And that's exactly what it is. And it's shocking to see how deep these problems are here in the United States. But, I think this is something that we really have to think about as it relates to the prison industrial complex in the United States. We have the largest prison system in the world. We incarcerate more of our population than any other country in the world, including Russia and China. And we really have treated mental illness as a problem that society doesn't want to deal with, and we allow prisons to be warehouses where the mentally ill are kept, and prisons are woefully under-equipped and undertrained to deal with these kinds of issues, and this is the logical outcome when you use punitive measures to deal with what is essentially a public health problem.
And finally, today is the 30th anniversary of the only aerial police bombing on U.S. soil, an event most Americans have never even heard of. On May 13, 1985, Philadelphia police dropped a bomb on top of a house inhabited by members of an African-American political organization called MOVE in a predominantly black neighborhood. 11 people were killed, among them 5 children. Only 2 people survived. A 13-year-old boy named Michael Ward, who died 2 years ago after years of therapy for the trauma he suffered, and a woman named Ramona Africa. Africa will join Cornel West, Alice Walker, and others in commemorating the bombing on Osage Avenue in Philadelphia today. Meanwhile, journalist and political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal, who has kept the story of the MOVE bombing alive and worked closely with its members, continues to suffer a serious medical condition in prison. Prison Radio has just announced this morning that Abu-Jamal was transferred to a hospital and remains in grave condition. Well, Courtney, if the police had bombed a house of white Americans and killed 6 adults and 5 children, how different do you imagine, to ask a similar question to the previous one, how different would that narrative be today?
I think it'd probably be as different as if police shot and killed an unarmed white civilian every 28 hours, right? I mean, there would be a mass outcry, and it would be rightfully criticized as a violation of the rights that we enjoy, or at least should enjoy as citizens. But that's clearly not what happened in the case of the MOVE bombing. And as you said, that story has been written out of history in the same way that the bombing in 1921 of the Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a predominantly black community, was also experienced bombing, aerial bombing from the state. That story has been written out of history. We have a long, long, ugly and brutal history of racist state violence in this country that we have to contend with if we're going to be able to deal with the problems that we're facing now. And it's just, it's horrifying that we fail to talk about this.
Right. And people can find out more information, by the way, about the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal and his current medical condition at prisonradio.org. Courtney, thanks as always for joining us today.
Bye, Sonali.
Courtney Morris is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. When economists pronounce an end to the recession and point to new jobs being created and unemployment numbers falling, stock prices climbing, and a general exuberance about the national economy, few point out that for 99% of Americans, very little seems to have changed. Most economists fail to ask the deep questions of what sorts of jobs are being created and whether we're accounting for those who have permanently left the workforce. One of those rare sorts of people whose economic analysis is centered on basic human needs rather than profit margins is Dr. Richard Wolff. In early 2015, Wolff spoke at an event organized by KPFA in Berkeley, where he gave a wide-ranging speech on capitalism, the recession history, and much more. Richard Wolff is a professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he taught economics from 1973 to 2008. He's currently a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School University in New York City. He teaches classes regularly at the Brecht Forum in Manhattan. He's also taught at Yale University, the City College of the City University of New York. He's been a visiting professor of economics at the University of Paris in France and written a number of books, including Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism, Occupy the Economy, Challenging Capitalism, Imagine Living in the Socialist USA, and Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. Richard Wolff also hosts a weekly radio program called Economic Update, which airs on Pacifica stations KPFK and KPFA. Here is his recent speech, courtesy of KPFA Radio.
I've spent most of my life analyzing and criticizing capitalism. Been doing that for a long time. I'm a little overwhelmed these days because if you've been doing that for as many years as I have here in the United States, you kind of expect that the room will have an enthusiastic 11 people. And you persuade yourself, as I often did, that As one great leader once said, better fewer, but better. And that was often true, and then sometimes not so much. Now everything has changed. And even before I start with my presentation, I want you to join with me in getting a sense of how things have changed, so that when we talk about going beyond capitalism, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, you don't have a sense that this is some wonderful idea for some distant future, but you'll have the feeling, which I now have, that it's already underway. And the question is really for all of you and me, how do we participate? How do we help? How do we move it? But we're not waiting anymore. It's more or less here, which is both wonderful and terrifying. And if you don't appreciate both, you're not paying attention. So here, let me tell you just a few things that have happened to me so I can see it. I just came from Los Angeles. I live in New York City, so the minute you go west of the Hudson River, everything gets murky and it's all the same. So I told people I was going to California as if that were a particular place. I went to Los Angeles, which is different from San Francisco, as I'm sure you know better than I do. I had 3 days before I came up here. And in those 3 days, I did 3 presentations, something like this. The first one was in a place called Occidental College, and I was invited, and it was sponsored by the dean of Occidental College, which is already a sign of something, isn't it? And my talk was co-sponsored by the ACLU, and that's also a sign, because that's never happened to me before. They booked a room of about 150 seats, and even though they only arranged this about 2 weeks before I came, all the seats were filled. And we had a really good evening discussion. I said the kinds of things you hear on the radio or that I'm going to say tonight, and there was enthusiasm. The next night, I spoke at the Musicians Union Hall on Vine Street in Los Angeles, and a benefit for KPFK, much as tonight is a benefit for KPFA. And that hall was filled with about 600 people. A very good fundraiser for KPFK, and an amazement for me with the level of involvement. The third night, Thursday night, the 12th, was in some ways the most remarkable. I went to a city I had never been to in my life, Santa Ana. As I was being driven down there, it was explained to me that we were now crossing, and you may know this phrase, it was new to me, the orange curtain. I see that you knew it already, and it was explained to me. And my host was quietly trying to let me down, saying, look, there may only be 30 or 40 folks. It's Orange County. We don't know. So we walked into, it's called Delhi or Delhi Hall, in the middle of Santa Ana. It holds 430 seats. There was no empty seat. And about 1/3 of the audience, by my visual guessing, was Chicano or Chicana, which I understand is the population down there anyway. And so that part of the community was also coming. And the spirit there was, if anything, better than the 2 nights before. So I'm a little bit heady, and I want you to bear with me a little bit. And you better be enthusiastic when we're done. Because I'm getting to expect it. The last 3 years, I've done more public speaking than in the previous 40. Uh, Something is going on in this country, and I can feel it and I can see it in an ongoing way. And as important as anything I'm about to say is getting across to you what is happening to me so that you know it and you can build your thoughts about what's happening and what you're going to do around a sense of movement that is now palpable. I didn't think it would last 3 years ago. I didn't think it would last 2 years ago. I began to wonder a year ago. I don't wonder anymore. I don't know where it'll go. I have no idea. But there are too many signs happening in too many places. Pacifica, the parent of all these stations, gave me an opportunity to start a radio program in New York in March of 2011. And our program is now on 42 stations around the United States. And the last two, this last week, we got 2 more, one in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and one in Brighton, England. So, someone about whom the New York Times says the Marxist economist, getting that kind of reception tells you something is, after all, shifting. Big time. Okay. The capitalist system, and time to change it. Let's begin. Capitalism is one of the kinds of economic systems we as a human race have worked with. The 3 big ones that we talk about in economics a lot of the time are slavery, feudalism, and capitalism. So I want to begin by making sure we're all on the same page about what these 3 systems have in common. First, they're all born at a certain time in a certain place. And after they're born, they evolve, they develop, and they change. And then after a while, they die. Slavery was born, evolved, and passed away. Feudalism was born, evolved, and passed away. You can see where this is going. Capitalism was born in England, 18th century, more or less, spread, evolved, ... That's what I want to talk about. For each of these systems, slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, 2 interesting things. First, they were torn apart by a fundamental conflict that was built into them at their core. Slavery, the name tells you what that is. It's the tension between the slave and the master. In feudalism, it's the tension between the serf and the landlord. In capitalism, it's a tension between the worker and the employer. And those tensions are always there. For a while, as the system grows in its youth, those tensions are managed. And so the system reproduces itself. It lasts. The slaves accept the slave master. The serfs, the landlord. The employees, the employer. In each case, of course, both sides know, even if it isn't conscious, they know that that tension is there. It flares up. It comes into your dreams. You know. But you don't do much about it, partly because it's scary, and partly because whoever's on top, the master, the landlord, the employer, work very, very, very hard to make you believe that they're indispensable. The master tells the slaves, "You're lucky I'm the master, because I worked out how all this will work. I'm going to take care of you. You slaves are, after all, a little bit like children, and you need me to be the adult. I'm indispensable. You dare not do away with me, because you will be lost if you did. The landlord says the same thing to the serf. I hold it all together. I'm the one who works out the big plan of which you're just a little part. For a long time, the slaves believe it until the situation becomes unbearable, and then they do the act. They get rid of the master. And they have this amazing epiphany. We don't need him. The serfs accept it for a long time, and then the situation deteriorates, and they finally act. With anxiety, they get rid of the landlords, and they discover we don't need them. And here we are in capitalism. As you'll see at the end of my talk, how many of us believe that the business at the top, the board of directors, the president, the entrepreneur, the capitalist innovator, listen to the language. They're telling us they're indispensable. We can't do without them, and so of course they should get well paid. Just what the slave master told the slaves and the landlord told the serfs. Might we be making a mistake by taking those ideas seriously, just because the person who utters them has a Nobel Prize in economics? Keep that, please, in your mind. Let's look at the capitalist version of this. And I'm going to focus on the United States because that's where we are. Capitalism in this country really took off from around 1820 to the 1970s. You have to understand that history in order to know where we are now. For those 150 years, long time, capitalism in this system was able to grow. It was young, it was youthful, it made use of what it found here, soil, climate, got rid of the troublesome local folk. We were pioneers not only in going across the prairie, but in inventing new forms of ethnic cleansing. We didn't call it that then, but pretty much what it is. And we were able, as a capitalist economic system, to contain the tension between employer and employee. We did that two ways, basically. One, we paid our workers a rising standard of living. Not all of them, but most of them. For the whole 150 years. That was a way to manage it. And we developed an ideology, a set of ideas that were designed to persuade Americans that the capitalist, the employer, was indispensable, was the origin of all these wonderful technological breakthroughs, was the man, typically, and occasionally the woman, who made it all work. That story that I began with. And between the story and the rising wages, the system worked. It worked. It functioned. It led to that wonderful phrase, and very important one: capitalism delivers the goods. The idea being, maybe it's a drag to go to work in the morning, maybe the job that you strain to perform takes a lot out of you, but when you're done, there is that trip to the mall. Well, it's really actually quite important. In economics, we teach that labor, some of you may remember this from a course that you otherwise, of course, rightly wish to forget, but you may remember that labor is a disutility. Labor is defined in economics as odious, which is a peculiar recognition of what kind of system we live in. Work is odious, and people only engage in it because they get paid, and with payment they can go and consume. Consumption is your compensation for work. Work is negative. Consumption, the ultimate antidote. What's left out of there, of course, is anything having to do with human relationships, which have dropped out of the conversation. So capitalism persuaded the American people it's indispensable, the capitalist in particular, and after all, your standard of living is going up. It made the appeal of socialists and leftists and critics difficult, because since they focus so much on the standard of living, they were criticizing capitalism for not providing a rising standard of living. Not so surprising, it didn't do real well here, because capitalism did provide a rising standard of living. Makes it a little hard for your argument to get very far. Then in the 1970s, and some of you know my work, you know that I make a big deal of this, and the more I study this material, the more big deal I make. In the 1970s, everything changed, and it's never gone back. Here's what happened in the 1970s to think about. We had a very important technological breakthrough, the computer, and everything having to do with computing and telecommunications and all of that. And that had two big effects. One, it wiped out millions and millions of jobs that are now done by a machine. Automation. It's a long-term issue in capitalism, but we had a real big dose of it in the 1970s. And the other one is the jet engine and air travel. To make a long story short, we reduced the amount of workers we need by substituting machines, and because of the jet engine and telecommunications, it became possible for capitalists to have a kind of eureka moment in the 1970s. Here's what the eureka moment was. We've been focused on America. Capitalism came out of our revolutionary break from England. We've concentrated our factories here. We've built our storage systems here. We've built the offices and the stores, and we've really concentrated here. We've built the country up. We had that never-ending struggle with the workers, but we've made so much money around the world, and with our technology, we were able to give the workers a rising standard of living, or to be more accurate, to respond to the struggles of workers by cutting a deal. Let us continue the system here. More stuff you can get at the mall. But in the 1970s, the eureka moment was, wait a minute. We built capitalism up in the United States, like we did in Western Europe and in Japan, the places where capitalism grew first and developed. And we reorganized the rest of the world to be the feeder, to provide food to Western Europe, North America, and Japan, to provide raw materials, to provide workers, immigrants in huge numbers, and even to buy some of the stuff that we are producing in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. And we made all those areas that are tributaries poor. Their wages are very, very low. Here's the eureka moment. Why in the world should we stay here where the wages are high? when the jet engine and modern telecommunications can get us the ability to get anywhere in the world in a matter of hours, and through telecommunications to monitor, to control, to survey any worker anywhere on the planet.
Richard Wolff is a professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he taught economics from 1973 to 2008. He's currently a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School University in New York City. He also hosts Economic Update on Pacifica Radio, and the speech that you were just hearing was a speech that he gave at KPFA Berkeley in February earlier this year. Special thanks to KPFA for that. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. After facing mounting pressure from fans on social media, R&B star Lauryn Hill announced on May 5th that she was canceling her upcoming concert in Israel. On her website, she stated that she wanted to be a presence supporting justice and peace, but because she was unable to organize a similar concert in the occupied Palestinian territories, she canceled her Israeli appearance. While she didn't explicitly state support for the burgeoning boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, Hill is one of a growing number of artists respecting a cultural boycott of Israel over its treatment of Palestinians. But the increasing absence of art and music in Israel as a political act stands out in stark contrast to the blossoming of music in the occupied territories, particularly among young Palestinians. The story of how that is happening is told in a new book by Sandy Tolan, a journalist and documentary radio producer who teaches at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at USC. In Children of the Stone, The Power of Music in a Hard Land, he introduces readers to Ramzi Aburedwan, a Palestinian composer and educator whose journey took him from Palestinian refugee camps to an international education in music after he discovered the viola as a young man. Years later, he founded several music schools in the West Bank and Palestinian refugee camps. Sandy Tolan is a radio documentary producer who's created dozens of pieces for NPR and PRI. He's a co-founder of Homelands Productions, author of The Lemon Tree and Hank and Me. He's currently an associate professor at the Annenberg School for Communications and Journalism at USC, and his new book is out right now, and he now joins me in studio to talk about it. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be here, Sonali. Thank you.
First, let's start with Ramzi Aburedwan. He's the guy who, as a child, was photographed throwing a stone at presumably an Israeli soldier. He was 8 years old, and in many ways, even at that young age, he became a symbol, a very different symbol to what he is today. He put down the stone eventually and picked up a viola. But tell us who he was as a child, what his background was.
Well, he grew up in Al-Amari refugee camp, which is just adjacent to Ramallah. It was founded after the Palestinian Nakba, or catastrophe, the event that historians call the First Arab-Israeli War, Israelis call the War of Independence. During that war, 750,000 Palestinians either fled or were driven out, including Ramzi's grandparents. They were from a little village called Nahni, which no longer exists, along with hundreds of other Palestinian villages that are gone now. They've been destroyed, mostly by Israel. And during that time, in '48, when his grandparents went on their journey during the Nakba, they came to Al-Amari and began living there. And Ramzi grew up with his impoverished grandparents. He helped his grandfather sweep the streets. His grandfather was a street sweeper in Ramallah, and learned all about Palestine. And when the first Intifada started in late 1987, it was the kids, the Atfal al-Hijra in Arabic, the children of the stones, who were really on the front lines. So kids like Ramzi, at age 8 years old, the photograph you mentioned, he became very famous, much like the Tiananmen Square young man in front of the tank. It was a very iconic photo of this kid who really, along with thousands of other kids, were trying to expel Israel from the military occupation, which unfortunately goes on to this day, 48 years after the Six-Day War of '67.
So just incredible to think about what this young man went through. But of course, his story is quite typical, right? And the way in which you've described it, I mean, to think about what children go through, Palestinian children go through. I have to say, the descriptions in your book of being, feeling abandoned by his mother at such a young age, being ripped from his, the life that he knew, it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, there are people all over the world who've lost a lot, but I don't recall ever meeting someone who's lost so much. Father murdered, brother murdered. He saw a 9-year-old or maybe 12-year-old girl who he kind of had a crush on in grade school, shot in the head by an Israeli soldier during the Intifada, the first Intifada. She died 6 days later. And so you'd think a kid like this, living in a refugee camp, his grandparents were poor, really raised without a significant presence of either parent. For him to remake his life, he was very typical of these kids, this generation of the children of the stones, in a sense a lost generation. Israel closed schools, universities, even kindergartens during the first Intifada. Months at a time, schools were closed. So he managed to get an education, and then he had the opportunity to learn music later on.
So he essentially left his life in the Palestinian territories and for the first time stepped onto Western soil in, of all places, New Hampshire?
Yeah.
As a young man, where he was attending this music camp. And this was an incredible change and chapter in his life, too, going on to where he went on to really become adept at music. And I love how you described that he was amazed that everybody at that camp read the same language, and that was the language of music.
Yeah, he actually told me that when he first went there, he had never known anything but occupation, as most of the children in the West Bank and Gaza, even though Israel isn't present in the camps themselves. I mean, it's
Not
present
today,
from the air. Yeah, not today, but it was at the time. And of course, by air and sea, they're still, unfortunately, they're very much there now. It's an occupation by air and sea, essentially. But in any case, back then, Ramzi really didn't know anything but occupation, and when he got this opportunity to get a fellowship, it was during this sort of more hopeful time for many people of the Oslo era. It was before the flaws of Oslo had been as universally exposed as they are now. And many people thought this was going to lead to an independent Palestinian state. And Ramzi, in a sense, was the embodiment of many of those hopes. And so he went to New Hampshire thinking that it would be like all the other places he'd seen on television that America represented to him, which was there'd be skyscrapers everywhere. And he went to this rural place in this leafy chamber music camp in New Hampshire and learned Mozart. And when he first practice, the first rehearsal, he looked around and said, wait a minute, this guy is Chinese and this kid's Israeli and this one's American, and they're all looking at the same music. He thought that his music was somehow Arabic music.
Now, he went on then to found a series of schools in the Palestinian territories and also in Palestinian refugee camps. And you start out in your book saying that he had told you that this was his dream when he was much younger. And years later, I mean, not many of us can say that we really fulfilled the dream that we explicitly set out for ourselves. How did he go about fulfilling that dream, and what has he accomplished today?
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting ways to look at it, I mean, if some people, when they see, oh, it's so nice that he's put down the stone and he's picked up a viola, and he would say, I just literally changed the instruments of my resistance to the occupation. He sees music as a force of resistance, and we can talk more about that. But what when I first met him, it was in '98, during this more hopeful time when people thought the two-state solution was actually going to be possible. He at that time, when I did a long piece about him for NPR, and he said, you know what I want to do? I want to open up music schools for the children of Palestine. He was 18 years old, living with his impoverished grandparents in the refugee camp then. Then he got an opportunity to study in France, and he kept his focus. He always wanted to do that. Meantime, I lost touch with him for probably 10 years and ran into him quite by mistake, by chance, at an Italian restaurant in Ramallah. And I said, Ramzi, what are you doing now? He said, oh, I'm opening up music schools for the children of Palestine. He always kept his focus. And it wasn't so much that he just wanted, it's not like a kumbaya moment where suddenly you have this piece of, it is a nonviolent way of dealing with the occupation, but it's for Ramzi, it's about protecting the children with music so that they can cope with the day-to-day reality of the occupation, which is, for many people in America, really off the radar screen.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up because, of course, on the surface of it, for people who do know what's happening in the occupied territories, to focus on music education while Gaza gets bombed, every other summer,
Yes.
It might sound like a jarring disconnect. Why is music so important within a context in which people are being killed in wars, are being occupied and repressed in the West Bank,
Yes.
even inside Israel, of course, Arab Israelis facing their own repression, in the Palestinian refugee camps, horrible conditions. Why is a focus on music a constructive thing?
Yeah. Well, it's a very good question, and it's one that Ramzi has asked himself. And a lot of the people, when he brought, like the Pied Piper he is, all these French musicians to begin to explore the idea of a music camp, they debated themselves this very question. There's a couple of answers to that. One is, during the Second Intifada, which was much more violent and much more loss of life, which began in late December 2000, when Ariel Sharon made this provocative visit to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, and where the Temple of the Mount also is, he really didn't know whether it made sense for him to continue this dream. So one time, a couple of years later, when the Second Intifada was still raging, he made a visit to a school of rehabilitation in Al-Amri refugee camp. And when he went and played the bouzuk, he also plays the Arabic bouzuk, and the kids were gathering around, and he noticed that on the walls and on the floor, the butcher paper, they were drawing pictures of tanks with orange fire exploding, mothers crying. And he thought, when I'm in France, I see, kids, when I visit a school, drawing sun and moon and stars and houses. Kids draw what they see. And he left and came back a week later, and suddenly the kids were all gathering around him, and he saw that what they were drawing was musical instruments. And that was the moment that he made a commitment. And he's told me, and anybody who will listen, many times, I want this music to protect these children from the soldiers.
Right.
Now that sounds sort of like a soundbite in a way, but if you look at the research that's been done in war zones in South Africa under apartheid, Northern Ireland during the Troubles, Bosnia, the idea that music can actually transform the way that children see themselves and make them feel stronger and give them a different identity is really important. But there's one other thing that's important to mention. Ramzi and Al-Kamanjati, which means the violinist in Arabic.
And that's the name of his school.
The schools that he started. They use music as a way to confront the occupation. So, one of the most amazing things I witnessed was at the checkpoint, the Kalandia checkpoint that divides Israel, divides Jerusalem from Ramallah. It's just one of the most depressing places on earth. It's huge, just fences and cattle chute guardrails and gun turrets. And these kids did what I would call, I called Operation Mozart. They did basically a peaceful guerrilla assault with music and set up their orchestra, their music stands right in front of the soldiers at this checkpoint and played Mozart. It was a way of basically saying, we are here, we are reclaiming this space, we belong here, and we are putting the occupation into the public light.
Now, the late and great Edward Said also figures into the story. And when we talk about music and art in general as a form of resistance, this was something that he also deeply espoused, and was just a great believer in the power of music. Can you tell us a little bit more about his role in this story?
Yes. Well, he, you know, as you well know, Sonali was a great champion of Palestinian rights from his post at Columbia, and also a professor of comparative literature, author of Orientalism and many other well-respected books, but probably best known as a fierce defender of Palestinian rights. And he became very frustrated with Oslo. If you look at the growth of the settlements, not including the West Bank, I mean, not including East Jerusalem, the West Bank itself, outside of East Jerusalem, the population at the beginning of Oslo of Jewish settlers was 109,000. Today it's more than 350,000. This is during the so-called peace process. Edward early on saw this and became very disillusioned by it, and yet he wanted to find some sort of alternative model. By chance, he met the Israeli composer, Argentine-born classical music genius Daniel Barenboim. They struck up a very deep friendship that Barenboim himself says that they were intellectual soulmates, he told me. And they spoke every day until Edward died in 2003. And it was from this ferment of their friendship that they founded together the West Eastern Divan Orchestra. Now, the Divan doesn't enjoy the same sort of universal love that it had when Edward was alive and when they founded it, partly because the landscape of so-called dialogue under Oslo has really shifted to much more direct nonviolent confrontation represented by the BDS movement and by the Palestinians' effort at statehood. But back in this day, it was Edward's idea that we can create an alternative that can be an example. And it was this orchestra that Ramzi was invited to join and eventually did after Edward's birth, after Edward's death in 2003.
Right. So what do these music schools look like, and how have they transformed children? Because, when you think about the terrible life facing some of these children, from a Western perspective, it might be more important to give them food and water and aid, which of course they need to survive. But it's those other things in life that make life worth living more than just eat food and survival.
Right.
And so, of course, music and art and these sorts of things that we feel we have privilege enough to enjoy here in the Western world can make just such a huge difference. So what sort of difference has it made in the lives of young children?
Well, I'd say by and large, I mean, not to say that there's not poverty in Palestine, of course there is, but lack of food and water isn't high on the list. I mean,
and Israel actually measures very carefully the caloric intake of Palestinians and makes sure that people have just enough to survive.
Right, especially in Gaza.
In Gaza,
but,
yeah.
I mean, I'm not talking so much about Gaza, but the West Bank, where I took 6 trips for this book. But really what people need more than anything is freedom. The lack of freedom of movement in Palestine, in the West Bank, for example, I mean, there are something like 600 checkpoints, barriers, roadblocks, other physical barriers in a land that's smaller than the U.S. state of Delaware, which is the second smallest state. So what this music school does is it provides these children with a sense of freedom within the confines that they're living in, and as a way to symbolically confront the occupation. This actually changes their own view of themselves. One of the people I focused on in this book, who's the older sister of the girl on the cover, whose name is Shalalda, Rasha, her older sister, played the flute. And she told me that when she began to play, it wasn't as though the occupation disappeared, but she began to be able to contend with it and see herself in a totally different way. She said, when I play, it's like I'm alone in a forest, surrounded by a beautiful lake. I feel free. Now, of course, that doesn't suffice for actual freedom, but it gives these children a sense of dignity and pride that helps them contend with their lives in a more constructive way, and it helps them also become people who could be leaders later and in confronting the occupation itself.
What are the daily indignities that face Palestinian musicians like Ramzi Aburedwan? In your book, you have a sort of running story that you break your chapters up with of what musicians have to do when they need to get to a concert and an Israeli soldier on a whim decides not to let them pass a checkpoint.
Yeah, you really can't understand the feeling of it until you experience it, although hopefully I'm able to do some of that in this book. But the checkpoint is the ubiquitous, unavoidable reality of Palestinians. Their lands in the West Bank have been shattered into a kind of archipelago of islands within a sea of Israeli military control. When I first started going there, you could actually drive for quite a while without seeing evidence of the occupation. Now you can't drive for 1 minute, literally. I've actually played this little game with myself when I drive around. Can you actually drive for 1 minute without seeing evidence of a soldier, a patrol, military base, settlement? You can't. Wow. So, and checkpoints are ubiquitous. There are these things called flying checkpoints that are set up suddenly. These kids, one of the stories I tell in the book is Allah, the young violinist at age 10 in 2008, is forced to step out of the van. They're coming back from a concert in Bethlehem, and the soldier says, "What's in that case?" And she says, "It's a violin." He said, "Do you know how to play?" She said, "Yes." He says, "Play." And her sister Rasha yells, "Don't play for him." And she ends up playing this very powerful song called El Hawadi, which means the beautiful girl in Arabic. And it's something that gave her a sense of pride and dignity even under such humiliating circumstances. But those circumstances shouldn't be there to begin with. This is the daily reality. Another story is Ramzi's wife, Celine, who is Lebanese by birth and grew up also in France. She was at home with her 6-month-old baby. Ramzi was off. He often goes to Europe to raise money for the school and to make a living as a musician. He was actually playing for the Queen of Holland. And Celine was home alone with their baby Hussein, and she hears somebody at the door in the middle of the night, and she goes and sees the doors getting forced open. She thinks it's a burglar, and she tells them to go away. And it turns out she looks through the little crack in the door, and there's 10 soldiers. And they said, "Step away," and they break down the door and point their guns at her. This is in a supposedly autonomous zone in Ramallah. It's autonomous except for when the Israeli military decides that it's not and notifies the Palestinian Authority, and they come in. So they burst in there, pointing their guns at her. Turns out they were looking for someone else, and they apparently broke 3 doors down that night. And when I ask people about this, the thing that's most amazing, Sonali, and you ask Allah about, playing at a checkpoint or being stopped at checkpoints all the time, they just go, "Oh, it's normal."
Yeah.
These kids, that's what they know.
That's what they know. And, you've made many documentaries for NPR and PRI about this conflict, and you know how biased coverage in the media can often arise from giving so-called balanced perspective on this very unbalanced fight.
Right.
Have your own thoughts on this issue evolved as you've spent more time witnessing what Palestinians face every day?
They have. In fact, I think one of the things that's clear, especially with the growth of the settlements and what a lot of people call settler colonialism, it is an attempt to basically take the land. And it's been, unfortunately, largely successful, starting with Ariel Sharon, continuing with Benjamin Netanyahu, but not exclusively members of the Likud and of that sort of political bent. As I've seen what occupation does to people, to ordinary people, to children, to regular adults, how it stifles their aspirations that you and I just take for granted, the freedom that we have, just freedom of movement in this country. They have the right to freedom, and it's being suppressed. And to me, what's amazing is that when you talk about press coverage, there are many fine exceptions. Look, for example, at the work of Ben Hubbard from the New York Times in Gaza last summer. It's a shining example of how great journalism still does happen in the mainstream. However, it's amazing to me how far off the map Palestinian lives are. Palestinian lives matter too. And how far off the map the daily life and indignities that Palestinians have to suffer, like, unless we understand what that is, I don't see how we get to a point of arrival where you say, this is unacceptable, this can't abide. We actually have to end the occupation.
Finally, I started our conversation talking about the musical and cultural boycott of Israel as part of the BDS movement. Do you see some interesting parallels here in depriving the occupier of music and art and supplying the occupied with music and art?
Well, I hadn't actually thought about that until your question. It is interesting. I mean, the boycott movement, I hesitate to compare it in volume at this point to the successful apartheid boycott movement, but there have been notable successes in terms of for example, forcing Scarlett Johansson to step down as the spokesperson for SodaStream because they build a lot of their equipment in occupied territory. Stephen Hawking's declining to go to Israel. Lauryn Hill, you mentioned earlier, and Veolia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. The infrastructure builder of infrastructure all over the world. There were Boston area boycotters who basically kept it from a $4 billion contract. So you're beginning to see some economic impact. Whether this, together with a cultural boycott, will end up being enough to force Israel to change its policies, to end the occupation and begin to look at what people should be looking at now, which is equal rights within what has become a single state. Some with rights, some without. How long it will take before that becomes successful, it's hard to say. But it's true that there has been a lot of progress.
Sandy Tolan, best of luck to you, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Good to be here.
My guest, Sandy Tolan, is a radio documentary producer who's created dozens of pieces for NPR and PRI, co-founder of Homelands Productions, author of The Lemon Tree and Hank and Me, currently an associate professor at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. His new book we've been discussing is called Children of the Stone, The Power of Music in a Hard Land. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Corinne Gaston is our research intern. Joseph Stone is our technical director. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. See you next time.